We've all heard the old saying that you should never take anything for granted. In other words, whether this involves your health, family, freedom, financial status, or some other element, you should count your blessings because they can be taken away just like that. Indeed, expressing gratitude for what you have is evidently important, because if you constantly focus on what you lack, then you're going to be dissatisfied, sad, or angry most of the time. Expressing gratitude, or not taking anything for granted, also puts everything into perspective because not everyone is as fortunate in terms of circumstances, material possessions, and opportunities. Nevertheless, even if we express gratitude for what we have, does this mean that we never take anything for granted? Or is it more likely that there will always be elements we take for granted despite our best efforts, and so should we, therefore, endeavor to minimize the number of elements we take for granted? Today's discussion analyzes these questions and through external observation, along with some personal reflection, asserts that while we'll inevitably take some components for granted, we can minimize how much we take for granted if there's a conscious effort to do so, in addition to expressing gratitude even when circumstances aren't proceeding so well. To begin, we frequently hear the phrase, "Don't take anything for granted," from people who have experienced life-altering events of various degrees. Irrespective of severity, the remark is essentially made to serve as a warning or a compassionate reminder of life's fragile and chaotic nature. I recently saw a news story of a man who was undergoing an experimental treatment for ALS at the University of British Columbia's Vancouver Hospital. The objective of this experimental treatment is to ostensibly arrest the disease's progression, or slow its progression if the treatment fails to halt its advance. In short, ALS is a neurodegenerative disease that gradually robs affected persons of their mobility, speech, ability to eat, and finally, the ability to breathe on their own. Once diagnosed, life expectancy is only 2 to 5 years depending on how fast the disease progresses. The aforementioned man in this news report has lived with ALS for 6 years, surpassing the normal range, and this is likely attributable to the treatment he has received. He mentioned how his ALS diagnosis has forced him to reevaluate his priorities and to, quote, actually start living, end quote. Indeed, realizing that he's living on borrowed time has certainly compelled him to take nothing for granted. The reason I highlight this story is because it's yet another example of how we often don't take this message to heart until it's too late. We don't cherish what we have until it's taken from us, or severely diminished compared to before. Health, freedom, mobility, and time are the obvious examples in this case, but this phenomenon can be extrapolated to many other elements. I've seen many stories like this before, and every time it happens, I cannot help but reflect on how it's essentially impossible to never take anything for granted, either during particular moments or 100% of the time. In my case, although I acknowledge that there are many aspects I express gratitude for, I realize that there are also many things I take for granted. My youth, health, and mobility for one, and I was guilty of this especially prior to experiencing my present affliction, but even in my current state, I tend to take these elements for granted. So, whenever I become frustrated about present circumstances, I have to pause immediately afterwards and essentially remark, what are you getting frustrated about? You have nothing to complain about because others are enduring far worse conditions and circumstances. If they can remain optimistic despite their suffering, then why can't you? Indeed, and I'm reminded of Rule 12 in Dr. Jordan Peterson's insightful book, Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, which states, quote, "Be grateful in spite of your suffering," end quote. It truly is remarkable how profound these words are, because, as Peterson and numerous others have pointed out, we're all going to evidently suffer at some point. The real question is, how are we going to respond to this suffering and hardship? Are we going to allow these afflictions to detract from our enjoyment of life, or will we be defiant and refuse to let them tear us down? Only we ourselves can answer these questions, and it's something that I'm constantly challenged with during the present circumstances. On days when the chronic pain I have is quite severe, it evidently serves as a test of whether I'll stand by these principles, whether I'll remain positive, or if I'll let the pain consume me. Building off these comments, I certainly think it's impossible to never take anything for granted 100% of the time simply due to our nature and finite time. Our nature frequently encourages us to focus on the negatives, which can be beneficial or detrimental depending on the situation. If we're in a dangerous situation, lost in the woods for example, we must acknowledge its severity, otherwise we won't escape unscathed. However, the robust tendency to focus on the negatives in daily life frequently occurs because of our environment and the people who occupy it. When we watch the news, its reports are inherently negative because that's evidently the nature of our world. Evil and terrifying, but also paradoxically fascinating to the point where we cannot look away. The latest Middle Eastern conflict is yet another example of this phenomenon. Political tensions aside, we tend to take things for granted because focusing on what we don't have automatically captures and retains our focus. The effects tend to be far more noticeable when we focus on what's lacking compared to what we possess. Money being an obvious example, and indeed, when we see how much debt we've accumulated, this captures our attention far more than the money we received from our most recent paycheck. Our nature and mortality drive us to continually pursue more, to acquire what we can before we expire, because it frequently appears that what we have isn't enough, or it never will be enough. So, how do we combat this problem? Despite the fact that it's impossible to never take anything for granted 100% of the time, does this mean that nothing can be done? Of course not. Steps can be implemented to alleviate the despair, frustration, and dissatisfaction that arises with the realization that we'll never be completely satisfied. The first tangible step that can be implemented to address this issue is the realization that what constitutes something not being enough is up to you and you alone. Here's what I mean. We witness people who ostensibly have it all by worldly standards, yet they still aren't satisfied, happy, or content. Money isn't an issue, they have successful careers, well-functioning families and relationships, but it still isn't enough. In these cases, many of us would rightly ask, what more do you want? What else could you possibly need that you don't already have to make you satisfied or happy? Despite seemingly having it all, the ultimate source of their dissatisfaction originates within their internal mindset and perspective. They're dissatisfied because an internal thought loudly proclaims, "No, despite all that I am and all that I possess, it's still not enough." Indeed, and they continue to justify this thought. Whereas on the other hand, we witness people in the opposite situation where despite not having many material possessions, not possessing high social status, and having more volatile circumstances, they are satisfied or content. They may desire to have more, like we all do, but instead of the former individual, their mindset differs dramatically. Internally they think, although I may desire more out of life, I realize that what I have is enough, at least at this moment in time. I know that despite several factors and by putting everything into perspective, what I have is enough, and if I believe it's enough, then I will be satisfied. The great French philosopher Rene Descarte famously remarked, quote, "I think, therefore I am." End quote. In this case, he who thinks or believes he is satisfied will be satisfied, and he who believes he is dissatisfied will continually be dissatisfied. As long as the thought, mindset, or perspective of dissatisfaction persists, then this state of being will persist. The point is that no matter where you are in life, or which chapter you're embarking on in your story, your mindset will ultimately determine whether you're satisfied or not. This includes whether you choose to repeatedly take factors which you can control for granted, such as spending time with loved ones, or how you react when circumstances are less favorable. Not taking things for granted evidently necessitates the implementation of a gratitude mindset. Be grateful for how far you've come and for what you have, because like your life, it can be extinguished in an instant. This doesn't imply not experiencing any frustration or anger, but rather it implies putting everything into perspective by regulating your negative emotions, especially when there are common everyday situations that trigger them, like family members doing something you perceive as annoying or being stuck in traffic. Expressing gratitude is typically perceived as saying thanks, but it is also expressed as showing restraint, compassion, and empathy. I can complain and vent my anger, but I also know that it won't make the situation better. By showing restraint, I'm expressing gratitude because anger is generally an expression of ungratefulness, like a spoiled child throwing a temper tantrum. Despite the pain, trauma, and injustice in this world, choosing to retain hope and do good works that stem from love of thy neighbor is how we ultimately rise above the evil. Ensuring that we fully savor the pleasant moments we're afforded is another method and something we should do more often, long before life-altering tragedies afflict us. It's easy to forget how good circumstances are when the going is good, but once the tide shifts, we cannot stop focusing on what we neglected to cherish. Alleviate the severity of life's tragedies by cherishing the positive moments while they occur and expressing gratitude, even in the midst of hardship. Gratitude, love, and hope will carry you through to better days, when the rain finally stops and the sun returns to provide its comforting warmth once again. Possessing this mindset will also ensure that when the curtain falls, the story concludes and death claims you, there won't be any fear, since you know that you're satisfied and ready to retire into the night, one last time. Thank you for taking the time to watch. If you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing.